Can we prove the existence of Jesus, maybe even the Gospels, without the Gospels? Now, I know that for people to make a faith decision, that it requires faith. But, while people might have a preference that would make them not want to accept the evidence, is the evidence though there? So, the first place I go is one place that people have not been going in the issue. And that would be some legends in Europe, specifically France and Britain, and I think a little bit of like Phoenicia as well. But these are legends of Joseph of Arimathea. And these legends say that Joseph of Arimathea would go to trade. He was a rich man because he was a miner of tin. And the only tin was in Cornwall or Somerset, England. So, according to these legends, Joseph of Arimathea was also the uncle of Mary, making him the great uncle of Jesus Christ. And as he would go out and mine, he took Jesus as a teenager out with him to mine for copper. And basically, he took him back home and then ended up many years later having to flee because the family of Jesus was assassinated, in a small genocide around the time of 70 AD. So, you know, people would think, well, this is all kind of like a myth. Well, there are some myths with it, and but not as much as you think. Not a lot of supernatural stuff going on. There's like one legend that he brings his staff, and he goes to Glastonbury after he's long after Jesus ascended to heaven, and he basically plants the tree, the great Glastonbury thorn tree, which lived for about 1600 more years, and now it's got progeny, other thorn trees there. Now, the interesting thing is that even though this is like kind of legendary, there's a lot of support. Britain has a lot of these tales of Joseph Arimathea. So does France. And what you find out is that, we have tons of these novels. There was a Glastonbury. Williams of Malmesbury had a historic record, but that record got burnt down in a church fire. The British had has an ancient church, and it was the first outdoor Christian church because everywhere else they would assassinate them, so the churches were all underground and hidden. But the Glastonbury thorn tree is proof that he was there for, or at least evidence, because it was a Palestinian or Israeli tree that doesn't grow anywhere in the rest of Britain. The tales have him sailing to Glastonbury, but when the monks had written those tales, it was a good 500 years before, or 500 years afterwards. And when it was 500 years afterwards, um, there was no island of Glastonbury. It was just a hill. What happened? Well, they made up dams because Britain was covered in swamps, and so they dammed everything up. And for thousands of years, it's not had water. But how'd the monks know that? And another thing that's interesting is that the Shroud of Turin was originally or officially discovered in Liry, France. And Liry, France is a itty bitty hole in the wall town. There's no real reason why you'd ever go out there. It's just a village. That's it. But the shroud was found there just about 10 to 15 miles at the most 10 miles from the Seine River. And the Seine River was supposed to be the trade route that Joseph followed, and all the other merchants would follow too. Go because the Atlantic Ocean was kind of rough tide. So instead of sailing out there, they would go up some pathways up France and then hit the Seine River and then get across the British Channel from there. So, you think, well, hold on, how's all this sticking together? Well, the Bible talks about tin for the temple from Tarshish, and you might be shocked by this, but a lot of Jews are considered to be merchants, and they were of a merchant class back in those days. So they would get rare metals and jewels and all that kind of stuff. And if you were to go to Tarshish, what you would find is that that would be the area of France and a little bit of Spain and England. And the only place that you would get tin there was in Somerset and Cornwall. Now this is an ancient time, so the English was totally different, and people didn't. They would call it the Cassarites, okay, where they go the islands for tin. It wasn't known as Britain or anything like that. Well, anywho, so if this happened, there'd be a lot of speculation, and you go out to the southern area of England and Wales, and you'll find a whole lot of stories and monuments. There's a lot of monuments to a teenage Jesus out there. There's a stone statue, and he's wearing a Jewish tunic, which would make him out to be a teenager and Jewish. And he would have his arms in the form of a cross. So, like a tourist attraction, they would say, like, oh, yeah, this is the place where we saw this. And so, all sorts of statues. You got some 600-year-old buildings that all have these stories and legends of Joseph of Arimathea coming on out. So, you go out to any vacation spot and you'll find a tourist attraction and a monument to something historical about the place. So that's what it was, and it was a strong belief, so strong in fact that a famous poet and philosopher, William Blake, ended up making a song that became the British national anthem, and that was Jerusalem. And did those feet in ancient times crawl upon England's mountain shore? Um, and did they build Jerusalem among those dark satanic mills? So this is a weird song, and it becomes the national anthem because it's the strong belief of the people. And so where there's smoke, there's fire. And basically, the idea would be that Jesus, of course, disappears in the gospel at the age of 12, and he doesn't pop up again until the age of 30. And we know that Joseph, the father or stepfather of Jesus, passes away. So at that point, he would have been taken in and mentored by a family member. And so Joseph of Arimathea, what's interesting about him is that in the Gospels, it also talks about how he's, there at the cross and everything. And then it talks about how he got the body of Jesus and then hewn out a sepulcher, carved out a sepulcher. Well, those things coincide with these stories. Um, he's around the family, and only the family members would take a body, after crucifixion. He was a rich ruler, and he needed to have some clout to be talking to, Pilate. And why would a rich man carve out his own sepulcher? Well, if he was a miner of tin, then he was an expert at doing it, and he took pride in doing it. So all these things kind of come together and just totally harmonize with the gospel where there's so many questions. But all we're asking is, did Jesus exist? So there you have a story. And the reason that story is of necessity is because the Jesus mythicist movement, it's really based off of this idea that the Gospels are myths. You can't trust them. So there is the faith, the Christ of faith, and then there's the Jesus of history. So it's got two Jesuses. And what they do is they say there's a Christ of faith and no Jesus of history. Well, there's a lot of assumptions in there. And one thing is this idea that there cannot be such a thing as the supernatural. Well, okay, fine. Then give up the Big Bang Theory because something coming out of nothing contradicts the laws of science. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed, right? So one thing if I think of that because there's God who can do it. It's another thing if you see it just oopsie, the cells, abiogenesis. You want to say that a trillion parts just came right together by accident and then we're able to reproduce? Yeah. And somewhere in the middle, stars. Space is negative 300 degrees Celsius, super, super, super freezing. And the idea that these gases formed and that these gases under that amount of cold became fusion, which is a high magnitude above fission, which is a high magnitude above normal heat. So super hot to super cold for nothing. These are miraculous. And so if you have to believe in miracles for your theory, well then guess what? We can record miracles and then, assume that they're there. Jesus was assumed to be miraculous. The Jews said that he was a sorcerer. There was, let me see if I can pop this up here. Okay. Let's see. Celsus. Um, yeah, Celsus is a pagan skeptic of Christianity, and he called Jesus a sorcerer. So you got a pagan or a heathen as well as a Jew saying, okay, this guy has supernatural properties. He also had Phlegon, and I'm losing the thing here. Okay, I'll try that one. Uh-huh. Cameron, where are you at? So it must have been her. Okay, well anyway. Phlegon, they record that the sky went dark, and that's very important. Basically, when Jesus died on the cross, the sky went black, and so they started talking about it. And there was a claim made that, oh well, that's just a solar eclipse, but you couldn't have a solar eclipse on that certain day because of the angle of the sun. So, and that was actually recorded in ancient times. So, okay, well, now he's a supernatural guy, and something supernatural happened in his death. And I've got a quote somewhere also talking about out in the East that there was, in the Eastern Asian world, there was an anticipation of a coming Messiah. That like, okay, he's going to be coming here any day now. That's kind of what they were kind of feeling like. And Chinese and Korean astrologers found a star pop up for about 2 months. Now the dates are off by a year, exactly a year, so there's just a little confusion there from ancient science, but kind of sounds like it's the same exact phenomenon. And so I believe that was probably the star. So now you have a star at his birth, you have darkness at his death, and you also have miracles. All this stuff is recorded. And then the ancient Christians, find that out. The most ancient Christians, they believed in his deity. Pliny the Younger talked about this. And basically, let's see here. Okay, he says, others, this is Pliny, others who were named by the anonymous informer at first confessed themselves to be Christians and then denied it. True, they said they had been of the persuasion, but had quitted it, some 3 years, others many years, and a few as many as 25 years previously. They all worshipped your statue and the images of gods and cursed Christ. So, they affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit. So they basically took these Christians, they tortured them until they would deny. In the habit of meeting certain fixed days before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. So the very earliest Christians believed in the deity of Christ. About 300 years later, you would see what we call the New Testament Apocrypha and the Gnostic movement. And the Gnostics did not believe in the personal deity of Christ. So essentially, they would want to humanize him more or make him simply a ghost and not really a human, differing opinions. But that attitude came centuries later. And centuries later is when you expect to find the myth. Instead, what we see is that from the start, Jesus is deified. And if Jesus didn't exist, they had 30 messianic contenders to go with. So it's very odd that why would you go with a fictional story instead of the real people that you're around, if you want to make your case. And so then we have Josephus. And there's a lot of talk and a lot of trash talk. you know, um, they have Josephus has a couple quotes. One is identifying Jesus as like the. He talks about James a lot. Apparently, he had kind of seen James at work, and he's like, James is the brother of Jesus. Jesus is supposed to be the Messiah. Then a couple chapters distant, um, talks about man, if you can call him a man. And, he talks about how he did miracles and how he was cut off and how he was the Messiah. And they say, no way. Josephus would never say that because Jews would never believe in Jesus. Well, Jews wouldn't believe that the Messiah was God. But it's okay. Like, Jews believe there's a coming Messiah. And if you guess Jesus, that's one of many options. That's fine. That was not the issue of contention. And it's still not the issue of contention. If somebody believed that Jesus was a great figure or whatever, they wouldn't agree with the Gospels, obviously. But, you could probably see them saying, hey, he's a good teacher and maybe a good prophet. It just got reinterpreted or something. So it's not impossible with that quote. And also, what's important when it comes to the Jesus Messiah quote is the fact that the quote was the first ever reference to Josephus, and his books are massive. I've got one that's about 900 pages. So why would somebody write 900 pages of material to have a quote? Or the opposite, why would they search through 900 pages of material that nobody knows about to insert a quote? And most of the manuscripts, all the manuscripts in Latin, easy, always have the quote. They only found like a Russian version where it was modified. I don't think one Russian text speaks for the Jews or Latin Jews or anything like that from the 2nd century or 1st century, I think. It'd have to be the end of the 1st century, could be the second. Okay, so what do we got here? You got a couple references to him as a historical figure. Then you also have the work of Tacitus. I'm going to find him. And of course, as I said, in the Talmud, the Jews didn't like Jesus. Most writers, however, agree in stating that once a disease which horribly disfigured, let's see, it might not be what I'm looking for. That's for a deeper study. Okay. But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration, which is a fire, was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of that report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus was from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, or Pilatus. And most mischievous persecution, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So, this belief and the superstition I believe he's talking about is the resurrection. I mean, he affirms the crucifixion as a fact. All right, so from here we have a good historical record. As I said before, we've got some other things, archaeology that can back some things up. James was not a believer at first, according to the New Testament, but then he becomes a believer. And not only that, but they find he's the brother of Jesus. They find his ossuary back in the early 2000s, and they debunked it. Then in 2014, a peer-reviewed research paper debunks that, proving that this really is the bones of James, which means that we have a real historical genetic line. Even without the body, we know that much. The Shroud of Turin was found also in North Africa. There was found the Sudarium of Oviedo, which was the face cloth. I had a problem for a while believing the shroud because what happened to the face cloth? Well, that's the Sudarium. The Sudarium is the face cloth. And they found a linkage of 114 different places on the skull that were scars, and they are identical between the Sudarium and the shroud. So that also makes the shroud a lot more ancient. But the shroud had threading that was 1st century. People are still talking about some of these. In some scientists, they attempt to debunk. Okay, they attempt to debunk evidence, and then when it's disproven, they shut up and they keep it from the media. But so it has 1st century threading that is what you would find from the women of the 1st century Judaism. But you have that match. Then they found what was called the Great Stone of Nebo, and they figured out the Great Stone of Nebo was a door. And that great stone matches in its measurements to what we call the Garden Tomb. And the Garden Tomb had the same measurements of height as the measurements of height for the shroud, like 5'10" to 11 inches. And why would the shroud be in there? I believe that Joseph probably dropped it off. Now, the shroud was kept into a cylinder container, and when you listen to some of the mythology, they talk about the Holy Grail, and many experts on all these ancient tales of Camelot and the Welsh King and oh no, King Arthur, yeah. So when they go over all these tales and they talk about Joseph of Arimathea, they say that he had a Holy Grail, which was a source of eternal life and kept the blood. Okay, so people assume it's a glass, but many experts have said no, it's not quite that. Well, I believe that it was the cylinder container, the Shroud of Turin, that was in fact the Holy Grail, because then it would be the shroud did have the blood of Christ, so the blood of Christ was in there, and so now you've got this connection. You got the burial place, you've got the burial shroud, you got the face uh, napkin or sedarium, face cloth. And, then the question is, where's the body and who moved the stone? You could argue that Jesus swooned and then he moved the stone. But, in the Gospels, it talks about how, the stone was great, like 3 or 4 thousand pounds, and even a regular stone Jesus couldn't move. He had to get other people to do it when he raised Lazarus from the dead. And so, as you're starting to go through this, the Gospels, you got to think, you got Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. There's a lot of mythological stuff, but there's a lot of historical stuff, admittedly. So, even if you have supernatural stuff and you don't want to believe in that, you still have to deal with historical facts. And the Gospels have a couple things going for them. They're reproduced, thousands and thousands of times. They have like alternative languages to show and keep the structure. And they have early manuscripts. There's a Gospel of John from 115 AD when the Gospel of John was written around 1995. And just other historical details that critics will admit to a younger gospel the younger writing of the Gospels, because you have what was it? The the Book of Acts covers the time of Paul. It doesn't have any problem covering assassinations, but Paul's assassination, that was somewhere around 60, 61 AD, it's not covered. It has him going off to the west on a mission, and that's it. So it would be apparent that his death was not recorded by Luke. Well, if that's a fact, then most of the Gospels are early instead of being, 70, 80, 100. No, it's pretty close. But yeah, if you have all this record, so like, if Jesus had swooned, well, he wouldn't be getting up. He had 70 pounds of herbs in his body. Okay, he had holes in his wrists and holes in his ankles. I've got some problems with my wrist right now. I injured it, and it's hard for me to do a push up. I still got the same muscle, but the pressure on there is just not that good. So, if I had nails going through my wrist or going through my ankles, I wouldn't be walking around. They couldn't balance himself and he couldn't walk. And he's full of herbs. Well, who moved the stone? Did Jesus move the stone? No. Did dogs move a 3 or 4 thousand pound stone? No. Did the soldiers? Well, it was they would have gotten a death penalty if they tried that. And no one has ever found the body. But yet there was 500 witnesses, 500 people that say, "Hey, I saw him. Yeah, he died on the cross, but I saw him. I know him. Yeah." So once you factor that in, I mean, it's like, oh no, everybody's insane. Okay, well, who moved the stone? Say what you want. Oh, they were grieved. Well, who moved the stone? You can be nuts all you want. How'd you move a 3 or 4 thousand pound stone? How'd you get past the guards? You see? And we can start really getting into the gospel details. It flows from there. So I was wanting to kind of just put these ideas together. So thanks for listening, Yak.